Okay, well, let us roll back the clocks and go back and start talking about your origins. I'm very sequential. I like to start at the beginning.
You don't have any pad.
No, I'm going to.
Okay. Great. Great. All right. Well, you want to know where I came from?
Not biologically, but I'd like to.
Okay. I was born in Ashley Falls.
Okay,
All right?
right, we got that.
Born in Ashley Falls. And my parents were English people. They were both born in England and came here after they were married. They lived in Palmer, Massachusetts, and what was the other town? 2 towns in Massachusetts before they came to Ashley Falls. They came to Ashley Falls right around 1900, in the early 1900s. I had 3 sisters and 2 brothers, so there were 6 of us all together. And out of those 6, only 2 of us were born in Ashley Falls, my younger brother and myself.
So you were next to the last in that family?
I was the last in the family. I was the youngest one.
Oh, I thought you said your brother was younger.
No, Bill was 2 years older than I.
Okay.
So I was the last one, and we lived in Ashley Falls. My parents lived there the rest of their lives, as a matter of fact, and I went to school through the 8 grades of elementary school in the school
The
in
one
Ashley
that
Falls.
all the controversy was about?
That's the same one.
Really?
Yes. That was 2 rooms. There were 2 teachers. One had the first 4 grades, and the other one had the last 4 grades. Well, as a matter of fact, my teacher in my first 4 grades came from Canaan, Florence Fitzgerald. She was a Canaan lady.
How far did you have to walk to get to school? Were you one of those that
I
trudged through the blizzards?
was one of those that had to walk 5 miles. As a matter of fact, it was 200 yards probably.
Oh, okay.
I went home to lunch.
No great stories there.
No stories there. No.
Tell
The only real story about my schooling was my beginning. It came time for my next older brother to go to school, and he was always, according to what I hear, he was always very protective of me. Consequently, when he went to school, I wasn't going to let him go to school unless I went. So I went to school and started school the same time he did. Somehow or other, he got to be a year ahead of me in school. But other than that, I went right along. I started when he did. And
so you started a year early? You were 5 when you started?
I was 4 when I started.
4, wow.
Yes. That's why I'm so smart now.
Well, I had to repeat kindergarten because I insisted on starting with Chuck.
Did you?
And they wouldn't put me in school, so I did 2 years of kindergarten.
Is that right?
Yeah.
See, you started young being a failure, didn't you?
This is the kind of abuse he gives everybody. Everybody.
Well, that's all right. That's
Okay.
all right.
Whatever brought your parents to Ashley Falls?
My father was a stone cutter, and he had a brother who had come to this country before he did. And there was I was trying to think of the second place that they had lived in this country, other than Palmer. That was Munson. And my uncle lived in Munson at the time, and I believe, while I don't have definite truth to it, I believe that the reason my father came was because my uncle wanted him to come and help run a quarry, which the 2 of them eventually bought. They bought a granite quarry in Munson, and that's what happened. They came and they owned this quarry in Munson for quite a little while, until my uncle came to Ashley Falls to go into the marble business there, and my father came along right after him and established this business of his own, the monumental business of his own.
And your brother took that over, didn't he?
That's right.
I seem to remember Bill in that.
Bill grew up, he only went to 1 year in high school and went into the monumental business, and he became as good an artist on the job as my father was, and I am quite willing to brag that they were both craftsmen. They knew their business and did wonderful work.
Now let me see. If you're the youngest, and you're now in your, as I discreetly phrased it, 9th decade.
Right, right.
When was your father born? He must have.
My father was born in 1867, and my mother in 1868.
Okay. I was trying to establish in my mind what kind of monuments he might have been carving as a young man. He would have been post that real ornate style that they had for memorial monuments.
Well, the monuments that he sold, most of them he bought as monuments, and then he did all the lettering on them. So he could buy whatever style he wanted from.
But they weren't into the willow trees and the urns and all of that.
No,
it was more perfunctory style.
I think there are many I would call plain, long plain designs.
Where was the marble business in this area?
In Ashley Falls. There was a marble quarry there in Ashley Falls.
My goodness, I didn't know that.
Didn't you?
No.
Oh, sure. They had quite an establishment there. It was the Ashley Falls Marble Company. They had a big mill. There was a huge quarry hole there where they used to bring the blocks of marble out. A huge crane that straddled this quarry hole. It was a wooden crane, heavy wooden timbers, you know, and they'd lift blocks of marble out of there that weighed tons, and here was this wood traveling derrick. There was a track on each side. There would be 2 wheels on one side and 2 wheels on the other side of this quarry hole, and they'd lift these huge blocks. Many times I wonder how they could ever have obtained heavy enough timbers to hold the weight of those stones, but they did.
That's wild. Now, where was that quarry?
Do you remember the railroad station in Ashley Falls before it burned?
No.
Going up through Ashley Falls, do you know where the road leaves the main road and crosses over toward the cemetery? If you go up the old road, the old Route 7.
Oh, right.
All right. Just beyond that, well, the driveway, the driveway to get into the quarry ground would have been on the left, cross the railroad track and turn left, and it would be on the east side of the railroad, immediately on the east side, just north of the center of the town. The quarry hole is still there, full of water, and a man came in there several years ago and built a beautiful home on the side of that quarry hole. At one time, the Smiths in Ashley Falls owned that whole area, that whole ground, and they mined stone out and crushed it the same as they do down at Conklin, for instance. As a matter of fact, the Conklin, for whom Conklin limestone was named, was involved with the Smiths in the quarry in Ashley Falls.
Well, I know that when they were going to put the reservoir up on top of Canaan Mountain, remember that controversy 2 decades ago? They did some test borings up there, and they said that limestone on top of the mountain was so hard it was almost granite. But I guess I never knew we had actual marble in the area.
Well, the stone, basically, this limestone that we get out of here is the same chemical composition as marble.
It's just how much pressure.
It's just a difference in the grain of the stone, purity, the whiteness, and so forth, quality of the stone. I suppose that for instance, if they quarried stone out of Ashley Falls and brought it down to the magnesium plant now, they'd get the same materials out of it that they get out of their quarry down here.
Probably.
I would think it'd be about the same. Maybe it's a little different chemical composition, but basically the same.
How come you didn't go into the stone business?
I tried it. My father wanted me to very much. But my brother had a family at the time, and they were both, my brother's family, he had a wife and two daughters, and they lived at home with my mother and father. And it just didn't seem to me, didn't make sense to me in the first place that three families might live out of that little business. As it happened, my father died, and Bill carried it on, and I suppose it could possibly have happened, but it didn't seem feasible to me in the first place. In the second place, one incident happened that led me to get out of the business. When was this? This was while I was still in high school, because I had decided before I left high school that I wasn't going into the monumental business. They had a piece of stone at their shop that they decided that they were going to. It was a piece of a monument, actually, the cap of a monument. It was pretty shaped, four-sided and tapered at the bottom. This cap would be tipped upside down, and they were going to make a vase for home, which meant that the inside of this vase, this block of stone, had to be cut out. So they gave me whatever the tools were, and said, "Go ahead and chip out of it what you wanted." Well, I started on it one morning, and by the time noon had come, my thumb here was just a mass of bleeding flesh. Where I missed the chisel and kept hitting down in here with the hammer. So that was one thing. I almost made up my mind that day that it wasn't for me.
Oh, I can see why not. Michelangelo, you were.
I was no Michelangelo.
So then when you had finished that, or made that decision, you after high school went to Pittsfield, as I remember it.
That's right.
And joined GE in its early days.
Incidentally, I did work with them in the Monumental Works a lot, but I never did cut any stone. I helped them quite a lot before I went to Pittsfield. So I went to Pittsfield in GE, and I went up there with the intention of taking their drafting course. And whatever course you took, they had drafting, they had pattern making, tool making, and there was one that they had given that they called their engineering course, but there were not many people who wanted to take it or who they wanted to spend the time with, as far as that goes. But shortly after I went in there, I went in right out of high school, so probably I went in July. And after school started, I would say in September, a young fellow came in from New York State, his family was a friend of one of the engineers in the works. And this engineer had told who became my best friend, about this engineering course that they had over there that would be available if you wanted to go over. So he came over to start the engineering course, and when he did, the supervisor of apprentices, this was called an apprentice course that I was on, the supervisor of apprentices came to me and asked if I would have any thought of taking the engineering course if there were going to be two of us. So I said, sure, it was a much better deal than the drafting course. So the two of us went through on the engineering course, which was a 3-year course. And as I say, he became one of the best friends I ever had. But he came to a tragic end too. However, that's not part of my story.
This, to establish a time frame for this, you went up in what year?
1924, I went to Pittsfield, and I stayed with GE until 1932, when the Depression was really having tremendous effect on employment. By the time 32 came along, almost all of the single men in the plant had been laid off, and I really overstayed my time.
You must have been good, though, because they kept you on.
Well, it wasn't because I was good. It was because of the operation that I was doing toward the end of my stay there for a couple of years. One engineering department, and the head of that engineering department was a fellow I mentioned who had told my friend about the engineering course. His department was a very small one. They designed and built high voltage DC testing equipment. Now that might not mean anything to you, but almost all electrical equipment then and now is run on AC, alternating current. And it's AC current is generated with generators, which are rotating machines, generally speaking. But this DC testing equipment was, the voltage was built up through a series of what they call Kenatron tubes. It was a type of vacuum tube, and it would be the higher the voltage you went, the more the larger number of tubes would be used to generate the higher voltage. And each tube had a transformer of its own, so it had to be insulated from ground. So they kept building these units, and with each tube in it, and would insulate it, build it up higher and higher, so it'd be insulated from ground. So we'd generate tremendous high voltages, which would be DC generating equipment, and it was used for whatever use they might want high voltage DC, but mainly for experimental work. I remember we had a Dr. Coolidge come over to investigate this equipment, and he was from the University of California, as I remember it. And we eventually built a set for him. And my involvement in that was testing this equipment. After it was built, it would come to my test area, and I tested those.
You were there when they manufactured their first, what was it?
Oh, lightning.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, that involved my wife.
Yes. Lightning struck once, huh?
That was done in the high voltage laboratory. Of course, that was something else. I was in there before I went into this DC testing equipment. So I was in the high voltage laboratory for a year or two.
He was always a high-powered guy.
Well, I'd like to hear again the story of you meeting your wife.
Oh, he'll
Well,
get there.
I didn't meet my wife. We had I did later. You're jumping the gun. We had gotten I say we. I had very little to do about it, but General Electric had generated 1 million volts in their laboratory at Pittsfield, and that was really quite an accomplishment because it had never been done before. And I was working in there with an engineer by the name of Meeker, and he was a little fella, but a brain. He was so smart. There were two of us fellas. As a matter of fact, this friend of mine worked in the engineering department where they were designing these things, while I was down in this test area testing the equipment that they built. So we not only went into the GE at the same time, we ended up doing the same, working on the same material, which was a little bit singular. So he and I were working, he was in the engineering office, and he would come down quite often to the high voltage laboratory for something or other. And this Mr. Meeker would have us sitting, well, the office was high up in the laboratory, so they had these metal steps going on, stairways going up to it. And every once in a while he'd have the two of us sitting down on these metal steps, and he would give us a lecture. Sometimes he talked 2 hours to us, telling us about the mysteries of electricity that we had probably never
Yeah.
heard of. He was just such a great guy, a little bit of a peanut of a fella, but he'd be a fella much, I would compare much like Steinmetz, you know, just so smart. He was a wizard in electricity, and we learned an awful lot from that fella. Well, getting back to our laboratory, one summer, I forget now just what year it could have been, but it was while I was in the laboratory. GE put on a couple of weekends, I believe. I know they did one at least, one weekend. They had an open house for the high voltage laboratory. One of the experiments that they always did was splitting wood with lightning, in effect. We would, lightning was made, it was just a condenser discharge, that's what it amounted to. We had these racks of glass plate condensers, build the voltage up into it until it just arced to discharge itself. You build up the voltage and something had to happen to it so it would discharge to ground. Well, we would have two spikes like this with a big chunk of wood in between the spikes. Well, we build up the voltage till the condensers discharge, and it would be just like a lightning stroke. It would go through that piece of wood and the wood would fly all. It was quite spectacular. Then another thing was a three-phase arc that we would make, building the voltage up with three rods that were spaced just like the apex of an equilateral triangle, three arcs, 3 points up here, and build a three-phase voltage up on those three points until they would arc across, and it would, as soon as the air broke down, you'd get those three streaks of fire across there, and it would go, and that thing that would fly right up to the ceiling of the laboratory, you know, 12 or 15 feet. Terrifying noise it would be, and that would be usually the last thing that we did.
Scare the audience half to death.
Well, in order to put this thing on, it was necessary to change transformer connections at a couple of times during the performance. And my job during this thing, one of my jobs was to get in a crane seat, which was a seat made to hang on the hook of a crane, and the crane operator would take me up, and I could change these connections and then come down and go about my other obligations for the thing. And that weekend, Priscilla's brother and his wife had brought Priscilla into the laboratory to see this demonstration of lightning, and she came in and she remembered seeing me on this crane. We didn't know each other, didn't know each other existed at the time as far as that goes. And it must have been, I don't know, at least 4 years after that we met in Sheffield. But she remembered seeing me in the laboratory.
Hanging around like
hanging
that.
on the crane. So that was her first sight of me, and I might have seen her too and wondered possibly who she was, but I'm sure.
You were busy at the time.
I was busy. So that was the way we first saw each other anyway.
So then you stayed there until 32, and then you
1932.
came back down to your home when
I
the
was
Depression
laid-
was really darkening up.
I was laid off in May of 1932, and came home. And as a matter of fact, I worked with the fellows a little bit while with my father and brother during that summer. But actually, through that first summer that I was home, I worked for Rodney Combs at the lumberyard. And I worked for Floyd Knight. Floyd Knight was do you remember
The
Floyd
electrician?
Knight? Not Howard. Howard's brother Floyd
he had the
ran
radio?
a battery and radio
That's
shop.
right. I remember he was in business until,
Well, he was in business a long time.
yeah, not in, gosh, I remember Dad taking stuff to him.
I don't remember when he went out of... he retired. His wife died while he was in business there. And that was right on Railroad Street. And I worked for him. The summer of 32, I worked for Rodney Combs and the summer of 33. No, I must have worked for both of them during the summer of 32. Because during the winter of 33, I got a bad infection in my knee, much the same kind that Henry Pizzetta had when he was laid up for a long time. And I was laid up all one winter with this one of mine. And the following winter, following summer, I drove 32, 33. No, part of the summer of 32 and the summer of 33, I drove car for Henry Ives, who had retired. He was one of the owner of Ives and Pierce grain and coal business in Canaan. And I drove through the middle of the summer, both summers, for him in Maine. I drove his car for him and lived with him up there those 2 summers. So I can't quite place. I might have worked for Rodney Combs one summer for a time, and with Floyd Knight the following summer, because I spent the best part of both summers in Maine with Mr. Ives. And the winter of 33 and 34, I drove for a man and his wife from Maine, and I drove them to Florida and lived with them in Florida all one winter, the winter of 33 and 34. And when we came back from Florida, Alan Fuller asked me if I had any desire to go into the hardware store, and I did. And from 34 on, I was in the
The rest, as they say, was history.
Die was cast.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was it.
Now, as I remember the story that you've told me in the past, you weren't trained in the hardware business. You just went in as a raw clerk and worked your way up from there until eventually you became owner of the business.
Well, I went in there in 34, just doing clerk business. We were married in 35. When we were married, my pay was advanced $5 a week. We were married in 35. And about 4 years after I went in, of course, Alan was as interested in banking as he was in the hardware business. Although he, during the early part of my years there, he was theoretically in the hardware business. But the savings bank was in the same building as the hardware store, so he would go back and forth through the back door into the bank and do whatever was necessary. He was executive vice president of the savings bank, so he was doing work in both places. But about 4 years after I went into the store, John Reed, who was, he would be cashier. He might have been treasurer of the bank, but he actually ran the business of the bank with one girl. He was taken sick, and he just broke down mentally. And right at that time, Alan went right into the bank and stayed there, spent all of his time there, and from that time on, I ran the store. From then till he died. But I just did clerk, and well, I ran the place until the war came along, and I was drafted in January of 1944, and left. And during that time, he ran the bank and managed the store until I came back. I was in service about 2 years, and when I came back, I went right back into the store, and life continued.
And you became a partner with
Then
him?
we became partners when I came back from service, and we were partners until he died in 1970, and then I became owner of the place.
You mentioned wages. Just to give us a little bit of a background, what would a clerk in a hardware store make in 1934?
Well, from the time I went into the store until we were married, I made $18 a week. So when I got my $5 raise when I took unto myself a wife, I was making $23. I paid $25 a month rent. We lived in the second floor of the building right next to the store, up over Decker and Beebe Decker and Beebe's plumbing shop, which was in the building right north of the hardware store.
Uh-huh.
And I paid $25 a month rent for, we had 5 rooms. It was a nice apartment.
Yeah.
It was a nice apartment. And that's what it cost.
When I went to work for Ronnie Schultz in 1970, I made $46 a week.
Did you really?
Yes.
Boy,
Isn't that funny?
you're a
Just
cannibal.
double.
I bet you were making more money than your father when he worked for us.
Oh, probably.
Yeah.
My mother told me that when he was raising the 4 of us, he thought that if he ever made $10,000 a year, that he would be able to retire.
10,000, yeah, it was unheard of.
Yeah.
That was unheard of. Yeah, he worked for us for quite a long time, and he was a mighty good help in the store too. I've forgotten just what years they were, but we were all so fortunate in the store with the help that we had. They were all honest, dependable people. I think along with your father, I think of Al Bershow and Mildred Manser. You just saw of the earth people. I could go away and leave the store and know that it was being taken care of, maybe better when I was away than when I was in the place.
Kathy, I wonder if you ought to,
Okay, you can start.
Showtime. Okay. Well, I think we have to lay a little groundwork here. We'd already revealed the fact that my father worked in your store and that we were frequent visitors.
Oh, yes. Yes, you really were. As I remember, about 3 of you would come through.
Yeah.
Well, at that time, the school, of course, was up on the hill,
Uh-huh.
and your home was down on West Main Street, so you're on a direct route between the school and home. Well, this was one thing that sticks in my mind about you, and I never took it as an offense of any kind as far as your father goes, because to me it was just such an example of what a little kid will do, you know. Well, almost every day, at least one of you, and usually the 3 of you, would come through the store on the way home from school. I don't remember whether you came around the sidewalk or whether you cut down through Pilgrim Church.
Usually
and across
Pilgrim
the
Church.
Did you?
Yeah.
Come across the railroad track and
Direct line.
come walk right through the store, and usually say hello to your father or whatever it was. And the thing that strikes me, and I don't remember as much about your 2 brothers as I do you, because you were just a little bit of a girl. I think you, as I remember it, you had long hair that was hanging down your back, and you would come through, and the thing that impressed me was your speech. You had a terrific drawl, and usually your question was always the same: is my father here? Well, one Monday morning, your mother called and said that your father wasn't feeling well, and that she didn't think that he ought to come into work. And I said, well, just keep him home till he's well and send him back. We'll get along all right until he gets in. Well, at that time, it couldn't have been long after your folks bought the house,
Yeah.
the big house there
Yeah.
on West Main Street. And I think your grandmother was going to move in with them, and they were building a room on the end of the house. And I knew that he had been working on that. So he didn't come in that Monday, and he didn't come in until later in the week. But as I remembered, about Wednesday afternoon, you came in as usual and said, "Is my father here?" I said, "No, Kathy, your father's homesick, and he hasn't come in yet." And you said, "He's not sick. He's working on that apartment thing down there." I never told Fred about it, but I don't know how many people I did tell, because I thought it was the cutest darn thing. The way you just innocently as not let the cat out of the bag. But I still don't question what he was sick the first part of the week, but he might have been taking an extra day or two while he was home to work on that apartment thing. It was so cute. Well, what else? What else can we talk about your family?
Oh, well, I'm sure we weren't the only ones that wandered into your path of,
No, oh, we had a fun business there.
yeah, it really
And
was a great store.
It was really, we had problems. There are always problems with whatever business you had, but
Yeah,
as we look back at it, and now, of course, I talk with Al Verschow,
mm-hmm,
who worked for us for many years, and whenever we get together, of course, our conversation gets back to the store,
uh-huh.
and we always agree that we had a fun business. It was, my wife always said she didn't know how I ever did any business in there, all the way I insulted people.
I'm very aware of that. Me and my
Yeah.
flea bag dog that you always were
Oh,
maligning, yes.
Your flea trap.
Yes, indeed.
Uh,
Well, I remember it as such a friendly store when you came into it. Of course, Dad was there for so many years, and consequently it didn't have a strange feeling to me at all to be in the store. But I just remember, I remember playing in the nail bins.
Sure.
I love the nail bins. And, oh, the seeds, I
Sure.
used to have the big open
Sure.
pails of seeds there
Sure.
rather than everything in little plastic
Yeah.
bags.
Grass
and
seed.
things. Yeah.
You stick your hand
Yeah,
down
and
the
let it-
corn.
Yeah, yeah. I'd forgotten the corn, but I can remember the grass seed.
Grass seed.
And it's just
You
neat.
speaking about the nails, we had another one that I must tell you about. Doris Powell's son, Richard? No, her husband was Richard.
Yeah.
Roger.
Uh-huh.
Roger Powell. He was fascinated with the nails in our
Mhm.
nail bin, and it happened that right at the end of this section where we had our nail bins in the back of the wrapping counter, sometime or other we had brought a piece of BX cable up through the
Mhm.
floor. So here was about a 5/8 hole in the floor right near the nail bins.
Mhm.
Well, the first thing we knew, when Roger began coming in as a little bit of a boy, he would come in and come around with the nail bins, and he'd pull a nail out of one of the bins and
drop it
drop
down.
it down through that hole.
Yeah.
He'd go and get another one, different size, of course, and drop it. He did that so much that finally we hung a pail under the bottom of the hole.
Oh, I love it.
Rather than tell him not to do it, we just hung this pail down so it caught all the nails. And then we'd have to sort them out, of course, but for
Oh,
a
that's
long
great.
time, Roger put those nails. He'd come in and put the nails. That seemed to fascinate him so much.
I remember, of course, being able to go behind a little bit. I remember the big lift that you had out in the back room.
Elevator.
Yeah, to bring
Sure.
the stuff up from the
Sure.
ground floor. I always
Sure.
thought that was the neatest
Yeah.
thing going, too.
Yeah.
Must have saved a lot of steps up and down those stairs.
It did. A lot of the kids like to ride on
Yeah.
it though, and if we had free time, of course, when the kids were in there, we'd usually give them a ride up to the second floor on it. Of course, you had to work it. It was just manual
Yeah.
operation with the rope. But this was one of the things that really, to me, added a lot of pleasure. The way the kids would come in, and we always tried to make a lot out of the kids and be friendly to them. And the kids seemed to enjoy coming in.
Yeah, I know it was always a nice feeling store, and I personally loved the smells of the place, and I guess that was both the seeds and the wood and the
Paint and oil
paint
and
all of the-
turpentine.
Yeah.
We
Remember the way you used to sell the was it kerosene or white gas? I know I used to get white gas there, but it was always out of the big
out in the garage
right out of the
in the
big
drum.
drums, and you just press the little spigot down and
Yeah.
you get a jar of
Sure. Yeah, if anybody wanted half a pint of white
Yeah.
gasoline, we'd give
Yeah.
it to them. Anything they wanted. We sold linseed oil and turpentine and alcohol, all of those things in
Yeah.
bulk. Usually people brought their container in, pint bottle or quart, whatever they wanted. We'd sell it to them.
yeah.
And it was so good. Nowadays, if you want some linseed oil, you have to buy a gallon or
That's
something
right.
like that.
That's right, and you get a tin that you have to dispose of afterwards because you can't refill it again.
Those are the things that are missing, that are gone. They're just, it'll never be the same. Or if anybody wanted, well, now down at Lindell's, if you want a stove bolt or anything of that kind, you can buy one. But I guess screw hooks and
They come in
that sort of.
packages.
They come in packages, so you
Mhm.
buy a package, which is, it's understandable that labor is so expensive now. That's the way it's handled, but wasn't so back then. It was just so easy.
Yeah,
Seemed
and
to
you,
be so
you
easy.
tend to go into stores now and wander around and
Mhm.
pick things up off of shelves, whereas in your stores, I remembered you'd pretty much come in and say, well, I need this or I need that, and someone would at least
I
help
was-
you get it.
I was talking with somebody just this past weekend about shoplifting, and they asked if we had any shoplifting back in those days, and I assume we did have some. Every once in a while, as a matter of fact, I know we had some. We would notice some item gone off the shelf, and just by inquiring among us, nobody had sold it. We assumed that it was shoplifting. We had do you remember the knife case that we
Oh,
had, that
indeed.
horizontal?
Indeed.
That was a drawing card to
Yeah.
every kid in town. I
Indeed.
guess. They'd
that.
stand and look in there. And of course, you could get into it. Anybody could get into it. Just slide. There are two big sheets of glass on the top that were the cover. You slide one sheet one way to get in that end, or if you wanted to get in this end, you'd slide the sheet of glass the other way. One day, one man, he was a barber in town, came in first thing in the morning, and he had his young son with him. And he came down to the desk where I was working, and the father says, this fella has something he wants to tell you. And the little fella came over, he, as I remember, he'd be probably 8 years old, and he put his hand in his pocket, and he pulled out a jackknife. He said, I took this out of the store yesterday. And I felt worse than the boy did. I
Yeah.
could have cried, right?
Yeah, yeah.
It was embarrassing, but yet I thought what a great thing it was that the father brought that little fella back in. He gave me the knife, and I gave him a lecture of some kind. I've forgotten what it was, but it was a very touching thing with the way he brought this little boy in here, in the store.
The most effective deterrent he could probably have thought of,
I'm
too.
sure it was. I'm sure it was.
Kathy, I wonder if, the thing that you like so well about it being kind of a meeting place. especially
I'm getting
veterans.
there. I'm
Oh.
getting there.
I thought you were.
It's it was definitely a community store, and I've always heard stories about Canaan as a commercial center, and how it used to, in its heyday, before people started moving out and going off in different directions in cars and whatnot, that there used to be a lot of activity in the evenings and during shopping nights.
Saturday night was the night that everybody came into town, and the farming people particularly would come in and bring their wives. They'd come in, and the wives would be around the street along with their husbands, and they'd meet their friends. We had certain people who apparently would meet in our store. There were two pairs of ladies who would meet in there almost every Saturday night. Two of them were sisters, and apparently that's about the only time during the week that they'd see each other.
Yeah.
And they'd stand there and visit, for the longest time up in the front end of the store, and just seemed to enjoy themselves. And of course, in that same evening, the different ones would come in and out, and while they're in there, they'd see some friend
Yeah.
who would come in. Saturday night was a real kind of homecoming night in those days, and it went. That Saturday night shopping went, and it was never the same after that. I remember I worked every Saturday night, and there'd usually be one other of the clerks who would come in there. And to me, it was just such a homey kind of a feeling to see these folks come in and just visit. I suppose many of them would come in to get something, but I know some of them came in just to see their friends and have a visit, which was fine. But then people began to be paid on Friday rather than Saturday, and that was a turning point. When that happened, all of the merchants around town felt the same way about it, that That was at the time when automobiles began to be more common and everybody was beginning to get an automobile. And rather than on Friday night, they would cash their paychecks and go to Torrington or Great Barrington or wherever it was. And we had meeting after meeting among the store owners to see what we could, if there was anything that could be done to help this kind of a situation, but it never was the same after that. We never did the business Friday night that we used to do on Saturday. So it was just, that was when conditions, shopping conditions in Canaan really began to change, and it never went back.
And I think the social structure began to change a little bit too along that time,
Well,
didn't it? Because TV became more important and people didn't go out to talk as much as they used to.
It's true, but the thing that I missed the most were these people who we'd see coming in and parade around the street. Around the street, there were a lot of people.
Did people kind of dress up to come into town?
Yes,
or-
they would. They would change their clothes, and usually they'd be spruced up. Of course, there were some who would come in their working clothes, but by and large, I would say that most people came in looking pretty respectably.
And of course, the movie theater and the entertainment center were at their peak along about then in terms of drawing people downtown.
That's right. There are a great many people who I think saw every change of show that came into town. You'd see those same people going up the street, going into the theater, show after show. The theater was really quite a drawing card to the town. It was used a lot, and at the same time, they had the Nicholas, what was Nicholas' name, who
At the
had
little ice cream
had
shop?
the ice cream store at the theater entrance. He did a great, Louis Nicholas. He did a great job, I think, with his store. I think he made a good living, did a lot of business selling ice cream, had booths in that little store.
My mom tells me, though, that you couldn't even get in there during a change in show, that they would be passing things out to people rather than actually shouldering in among the crowd.
I suppose so. But you know, they had, with the bowling alleys in the
Yeah.
bottom, they had a door cut in the floor over near the window that you would look in as you came out of the theater in his store. There was quite and under this hole in the floor was a stairway that went down into the bowling alley, and people who would be bowling would come up that steps
I
through the
didn't know
hole in the
that.
floor to get ice cream or
I didn't know
soda.
that.
Sure.
Oh, that's wild.
Yeah. Yeah. Come
That's
up
so
into
sad
Louis.
that bowling alley is gone, because even when I was a teen, it was still functional, and you could go down there, and it was really like stepping back 2 decades even then.
Well, it was, but Tony was such a Tony Boscardine, I mean now. Tony Boscardine was such a real businessman. I think he made quite a lot of money there in that whole theater building. Was his dance hall up above the casino, they called it, I believe, or was the whole theater the casino? Anyway, he had the dance floor up above and the bowling alleys down below, and his theater with Louis Nicholas' little store on the side, and it was really the social center of the town during that time. But it didn't continue after Tony went.
No, unfortunately.
He worked all the time in that place. Even would reshape bowling pins.
You're
So
kidding.
they're made of maple, and he was forever trying to improve a way that he could reshape his candle pins so he could keep using them. He, of course, they bowled what they call
Duck pins?
the
Right.
little pins with the small ball.
Mhm.
That was the most popular type of bowling for many years, and the pins were only about
Mhm.
that long, probably 10 inches high, maybe 12 inches, 10 or 12 inches high, and they'd get beaten up
Yeah.
around where the balls would hit. And he had an old lathe, and he tried to
Smooth it out a
reshape
little.
those so that he could keep them going. He was a great fella, and was doing this kind of thing. He would come into the store, see if there any, if he had a scheme to see if we could help him with his thinking on the thing, how to keep these going. He used our store a lot. Tony was a good friend. He had many expressions that he would come out with. His English wasn't what you'd call 100%. He had quite an Italian accent, and I remember one thing that when Badgley's, who ran the market next door, kept chickens out in the barn. They'd buy chickens and kill them and sell them in the store. And one day,
Wow, they wouldn't have let that happen anymore, would they?
one day, Tony went into the market and he had this chicken that he'd caught that had gotten loose. It was in the middle of winter, and he told Ken Roberts in there, he said, I think this chicken has the freeze foot. You know, it was cold. He thought the chicken had frozen its foot. He thought the chicken had freeze foot.
Oh, gee. I don't remember the Badgley's Market. Where was that?
Don't you?
Mm-mm.
Well, it was in the section of jewelry store.
Oh, really?
Well, Badgley Market had half of that first floor for their meat market, and Decker and Beebe had the north half toward the half toward the
Okay, theater.
theater as their
Okay,
store.
Okay.
So, they
So
had
when
the
did
two
Ronnie
stores.
go in there?
Well, first Decker and Beebe moved. They built their new place up above, and shortly after that, Ken Roberts took over the meat market from Badgley after Mr. Badgley died, and Ken retired about the same time, as I remember it, that Decker and Beebe moved, and there might have been somebody else in there between those people and Ronnie Shawls, but I don't think so. I think Ronnie Shawls went in there and opened up his jewelry store in the part where the market was, and took over the whole business the way it is now.
That happened much later. That happened in the 70s.
I can't quite
Because there was a dog
place this.
grooming business in there when I got married.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I don't remember the market at
Your
all.
sophisticated pet.
Yes, yeah. Okay, so they were your next door neighbors. What about the other side? You had Weber's, and then Mrs. DeBarberry and Jack's were there at the same time that Badgley was there?
Yes. Yeah.
And we had
Jack's
the A&P.
There was an A and
And we
P.
had the First National, too.
The A and P was in the. No, it wasn't. It was First National was in the building between Bob Weber's clothing store and DeBarberry's.
Where
I-
Bob's clothing used to be.
I think Tony built that
Mhm.
building that's in there now. Where Bob's clothing?
Mhm.
Yes, where Bob's clothing
It
was.
was, yeah.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, so we had more meat markets than you could shake a stick at, or more food outlets. You had A&P down where the old Colonial Restaurant was, right?
Right.
And then you had the First National where the
W-
Colonial
right.
Restaurant was.
After Colonial
The
Restaurant.
Colonial Restaurant moved around too.
Yeah, that's right.
So,
Philney James had it in
Right.
there.
and then you had this market that you were just referring to, the Badgley's, was it?
Badgley's.
And then Jack and Mrs. DeBarberry.
There was there was a room corresponding to Louis Nicholas Candy Store on the left-hand side of the theater entrance, and there was also well, same as it is now, the liquor store in there. Now, during the early part of my remembrance, there was what they called an economy store in there, which was like an A&P or grocery, a chain, one of the chain economy store, run by a fella from up Mill River way. I don't recall his name offhand, but there was that little store in there.
How many of those overlapped? How many were going at one time?
I can't keep them all straight. I don't have them all straight in my mind, but I'm sure that this economy store was in the theater building, and then down the First National was in this store where you were just saying Bob's Clothing was, next to DeBarbery's. And then well, first it was Tony Boscardine had the meat market in the building with Mrs. DeBarbery. Hart's store was in the building right next to us where Bob Weber came in.
Really? Hart's was there at one time?
Yes, Hart's started their store
Okay.
right in that building.
Okay. Now, where was Bianchi's clothing store? Because that was Hart's Five and Dime when I was a kid.
Bianchi was in the Canfield building
Ah, okay.
first.
And then it just moved right
Then
next
they
door.
moved it next door.
Okay.
Bigger
Musical
space.
chairs.
Right.
Musical chairs. So, and then Louis Consolini had, were telling me one time that Louis Consolini had,
His retail store.
and the donut shop?
Yeah.
With the, tell me about the donut machine.
Well, Louis opened a bakery way out East Main Street. Well, I don't know exactly how to tell you where it was. There was a section there that was called the Cut. Do you ever remember the Cut? Where it was where the old C&E track
Right.
went over Route 44, which was out on the opposite side from First National now, and farther toward East Canaan, a little way. He owned a good-sized building there, and he opened a bakery on the first floor. I've learned fairly recently that when Louis opened his bakery, he sold all of his output to Bill Perotti, and Bill Perotti peddled Louis Consolini's bakery products
You're kidding.
all around the area. That was before Bill Perotti became a plumber.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, it was, and I believe that that connection just lasted a short time, a couple of years maybe, and Louis became quite successful in the bakery business, and he had 2 or 3 or 4 trucks of his own. Then after Bill Perotti went out of the picture, he had his own trucks who traveled around the countryside selling his stuff, and he opened a little store in the building where Bob's Clothing is now. There were I guess at least 3 little stores. Well, Connecticut Western News was in part of it. They were in the end to nearest Main Street. There was the Connecticut Western News, and then this little store that was Louis Consolini's retail bakery store, and then the shoemaker was in the last one, Moxie Parentoni. He had the shoe repair business down there, and he was another great little Italian fellow. But Louis opened this little retail store there where he sold his bakery products down on Railroad Street, and he bought the first automatic donut making machine that I had ever seen. And he had that right in his window, and the thing just operated all by itself as long as he wanted, all day and all night too, I suppose. He put his dough or whatever it was, his mixture, in a hopper at the top of this machine, and then there would be some kind of a contrivance down here where the dough would come out of the bottom of a funnel-shaped receptacle into a little contrivance that would spill a roll of dough. There'd be a roll of dough come out, 360, or a whole ring of it, and then it would cut off, and that little ring of dough would drop down into the hot oil down beneath, and it would cook at a certain length of time. And then there was a little gadget in the bottom of the oil that would come up and flip all of those donuts over. They'd be all cooked on the
Yeah.
bottom and white on the top. Flip them over, and pretty soon the same contrivance would lift the whole business out,
That's
put
wild.
them onto some a slide or some sort of thing.
Perfect advertisement for a bakery.
It was the most fascinating thing to me. I sometimes go to the post office purposely just to see that machine work for a while.
How come you never took a picture of this wonderful machine?
I don't know. That probably was before I began taking pictures. I don't know when I began taking pictures, actually. I can't tell from the people that I took pictures of, although I have them of Moxie Pear. I have a picture of Moxie Pear and Tony in his store there. Well, that's another chapter anyway. The picture taking, but.
But you
I don't-
started
I
that. You started that pretty
while I was
early
working
on
in-
because you've got
while I-
pictures of J. Clinton Rohrback and other
Oh,
people.
yes.
And those dresses on that lady in the picture, those I remember were early 40s, were they not?
Oh yes, I'd have begun taking them. Let's see now. I got my first 35 millimeter camera when our son was about 2 years old, and he's 50. Well, 50 years ago, just about 50 in 1940, I would have begun making slides shortly after 1940.
That seems about right
Yeah,
because
that's right.
You remember that neat picture of them standing by their rose garden there between what?
Kathryn
Ye-
and Clint Rohrback?
It was Mrs. Rohrback, I think, not Kathryn.
No, it would have been Kathryn, not the Kathryn
Not this
that
Kathryn,
you
but
know.
yeah.
No, it was Clint's sister.
Ah, okay.
She was a maiden lady, and Clint was a bachelor, and they lived in the house there.
And that
after
was
their
between the
parents died.
law office and what is now L's Quinlan and Robinson.
It was in the L's Quinlan and Robinson
Yeah,
building.
I'm just thinking of the one where
Oh,
they're in front of the gardens.
Their arbor was
Yeah.
was on
Yeah.
the back edge of that
Yeah.
lawn between the law
Yeah.
office and their house.
Beautiful, beautiful flowers. I always thought
Well,
somebody ought to do that again when I saw that picture.
Clint never did a stroke of work of that kind, you know. He was a lawyer. But he had a fella, do you remember Theodore Johnson? The black man?
Yes, I do.
I say black man. He was a young fellow when he started working for
Was he the
for
man who
Clint.
was killed
He,
just a few
he was
years
killed
ago
in a fire. He was
Right.
burned in the fire. And he was the nicest young fella. And he worked for Clint for years, and he did all of the work around
that
the
was so
Rohrback
pretty.
house.
So pretty.
Yeah.
Action. So you came as a young man to Canaan and went to work in the hardware store after a couple of years of moving around, and you stayed there through your entire career, and eventually came to the other end of that career, and during that time, as I remember Fuller Hardware, it got to be kind of a substantial business. You had your area out back where you had materials stored, and you had that building up on Railroad Street.
Up on Railroad Street. We had a storehouse up on Railroad Street, and we had a storehouse out in back of our store. And then we had a basement in the store, and a second floor. We had two stores above, but we never used the upper one. That was originally a Oddfellows Hall and a dance floor, which we never used for anything to do with the store business. But we did the second floor. That was all merchandise.
Did you ever have a dance up on that top floor?
I remember going to a dancing class when I was in high school on the third floor of the building.
Oh, that's
I
wild.
had a fellow came in from Winsted. His name was Gillette, and I don't know how long he ran it, but it seems to me as if my brother and I came down the first year that he had it through the winter. We would walk from Bill and I would walk from Ashley Falls down here and go to dancing class, then walk home.
There's
to
our
Ashley-
walking story.
Ashley
We got
Falls.
one. It took us a while, but we got a
Got a
walking
walking
story.
star. That's it. Yeah. Yes,
Through
it
the
was.
blizzards.
We did. I don't remember any hard time with that though. It was The dance kept us warm, I suppose. Yes, they had this dancing class. I thought for at least 2 years. I don't remember how much longer it went.
Mm-hmm.
But we used all of that area for store things. When the storehouse up above, we always kept cement. We
Mhm.
bought cement by the
Mhm.
carload, came in by railroad freight, and roofing all of our roofing we kept
Mhm.
up there.
And unload it right on the siding and bring it in, huh?
Yeah.
I remember my father working up there, and I always remember my father as a very young man somehow.
Well, you
And-
know, one of the really hard jobs in the
Mm.
hardware business at that time would be when we get a carload of
Yeah.
cement. Now that cement always came in paper bags, an eighth of
Mhm.
a barrel. We bought it by the barrel.
Mhm.
That was the unit of purchase, but it always came in paper bags,
Mhm.
94 pounds to the bag, which
Oh.
was an eighth of a barrel. And that would be loaded at the cement kilns
Mhm.
while the cement was hot. Well, it could be a week or more after the car was loaded that we would get it down here and start to unload it, and that cement would be just as hot then as it was
It
when
would
it was put in back.
retain the heat.
Well, the car was just packed. They were
Mhm.
packed tightly with cement bags, and they would keep that heat for days.
Hmm.
And in the summertime, unloading a carload of cement, not only with the outdoor heat, but when you'd be handling this hot cement,
Wow.
it wasn't an easy job.
No.
That was really hard work,
I bet.
and it took a long time. Those cement bags were slippery. We load them onto a hand truck and bring it down out of the car on a ramp to the floor and unload it. I'm sure your father helped unload more than one carload of cement up there.
Seems to me I remember it somehow. It must have been impressive to me as a little kid to see this stuff happening or something.
Well, it was a hard job. I remember it.
And
well.
I remember he showed me one time, didn't you have a card of wire gauges or something up there that were like sample wire gauges? Or
Could
am I
have been.
mixing things up there?
We had sometimes when we get a carload of wire goods. Now that would be
Mhm.
fence wire,
Mhm.
some 4-foot woven fence wire,
Mhm.
barbed wire, and all of that
Mhm.
stuff. And usually when we bought that, we bought part of a carload of
Mhm.
nails,
Mhm.
and they came in wooden kegs, 100 pounds to the
Mm.
keg. They weren't as hard to handle as a bag of cement, even
Mhm.
though they both weighed about the same. Because a little keg of nails
Mhm.
was an easy thing to pick up.
Mhm.
All you had to do was have a strong back and
Yeah.
a weak mind, and you could handle that kind of stuff. And I suppose that we might have had a nail. You mean a nail chart?
Yeah, it seems to me I remember it, but I may be mixing it up from someplace
Well,
else.
we could have had one nailed up in there, and we probably had one nailed up in the
Mhm.
storehouse out in back of the barn, back of the store.
Yeah, I do remember. I do remember going to both the garage back there, and so you really had quite a lot of storage space, even though your commercial area, your selling area, was rather small.
That's right. We had a lot of goods that weren't out on the store floor.
When did you start to phase all of that out? You sold the business when?
I never phased it.
Mm-hmm.
It just went all of a sudden. In 1976, one morning I was working there in the store, and a well-dressed fella came down at the back of the store, and he said, "Did you ever have any mind of selling your business?" And I told him that it was a thing that I would have to admit that I'd given thought to it one time or another, but had never done a thing about it. Because I just didn't have any idea how it would how it would be handled. But I knew it was getting toward the time when I'd have to begin thinking about it, because I was getting well along in years, and something would have to happen. So, but I said I probably had thought a little bit about it, but never seriously. But if he had anything in mind, I could give it consideration. He said yes. He had some people, a couple who had come to him, asked him to look for some kind of business such as this around, and I should give it some consideration. So we did, and Priscilla and I decided that if we had the opportunity to sell it, now would be a good time to do it. So it developed that it did materialize, and one thing that always made me feel so good during that period when we were making our terms and so forth, the fellow who bought it was a hardware man. He had owned a business down on Long Island, and I thought after I got to know him fairly well, I thought that he would be the kind of a fellow who would be good to come in and just continue the business. It developed otherwise. But the point that I'm getting at is, he said one day, he said, as we were talking about the whole deal, how much inventory do you have? And I knew the approximate value of it, and I told him how much inventory there was. And he said, well, I've been looking around the store, and I would guess that what the figure that you give is probably about right. I said, now, ordinarily I think probably when you're buying a business, or when I was selling a business, that we'd have to take an inventory. And he said, no, if you say there's this much value here, I think it's right, and all we do is shake hands on it, and that's all there is to it. And I thought how trusting the fellow was, coming from Long Island.
Yeah.
And yet my own personal feeling was that the figure that I gave him, I felt was an honest figure. And the payoff of the thing was that when he finally took the business over, I made sure that he had more than that value of merchandise in the place. So I never felt the least bit concerned, or my conscience never troubled me a bit, and I don't think it ever bothered him. I think he felt very happy.
What he wanted.
Unfortunately, he wasn't successful. He just ran the business down until it was practically nothing before he sold it.
And it didn't last very long after that.
And he died right there in the store,
Yeah.
which was an unfortunate thing.
Heart attack, was it? I remember that
So
was
that
short-lived and unfortunate.
We just got out of the business, and I stayed with him about 3 months after he came to get him acquainted with the people as I could around town, and finally he took over, and I got out. And
Did you miss it when you were out?
one thing having to do with this was that the day that we actually sold the place. And I said I stayed with him about 3 months after that. I remember going home and telling Priscilla, well, the store is not ours any longer. And what he does in there now, if he wants to make any changes, it's going to be perfectly all right with me. And I'll be working down there for a while, but it's not going to bother me a particle. But he began making changes, and it irritated me so much all the time that I was there.
Yeah.
Of course, I had never said anything to him about it, but some of them were so hard to live with. But you mentioned missing the store. After I went out, I never missed the store a particle, but I did miss seeing the people. I used to see every day, every once in a while people would come in there, and it was entirely different that way, and I missed the folks, but I never missed the store.
Well, that's kind of reflected, I think, a little bit in your photography, that liking for the people, because you've got so many of them on film.
Possibly so.
That chronicling of the decades of Canaan. You didn't plan that, did you? That just kind of happened? The way,
Just happened.
yeah.
You mean the picture stuff?
Yeah, right.
You know that railroad engine and coal car that's in the savings bank?
Yeah, the one Dad took off the
He
depot.
I have a picture of him taking that off.
Yeah.
I guess maybe I've told you that before. Yeah. And another thing about that locomotive was, at the time I was working for Floyd Knight, long before I ever had any idea of going into the store. While I was working for Floyd, Alan asked me if I could make parts for that old locomotive, parts that had deteriorated on the thing. Apparently they had taken it down at that sometime around that time and had seen what it was. They needed a smokestack for it. There's a smoke, one of those that comes out to a big funnel shape at the
Right,
top,
right.
and a headlight. They had disappeared. So while I was working for Floyd, I made a smokestack. That's a
that's neat.
smokestack that's on it now. That was made out of lead. I filled a tin can full of lead, made a little cylinder of it, and then put it on a lathe and turned it out. And
That's wild.
the headlight, as I remember, I put a coin of some kind, an old copper penny or something like that, on the front of that square lamp as the lens for the.
I'll have to go in and
It's
take
still-
a look at that
it's
thing
still
and
on
look
there, yeah,
closely.
yeah.
How old is that thing? Do you have any idea?
I don't. Maybe it tells on it might tell on the card that there used to be a card under it. I know they were afraid that that was going to disappear with the selling of the railroad and the station, that thing would disappear. So Alan had us take the thing down off the station and put it in the savings bank where it's
Yes.
supposed to stay.
I think it belongs to the fire district now, doesn't it?
Could be.
I believe it does, because it was under Dad's jurisdiction for quite a long time.
The same as the water tank, big water tank over it. Is that still there? Or has
Yeah,
that been?
still
Still
there.
there.
Still there. Matter of contention right at the moment.
Is it?
Yeah.
At one stage, after the fire district took it over, the roof of that thing had to be painted. It was, well, the whole thing was painted, but the roof particularly needed painting. So I asked Roy Bojan one time if he'd go up there with me and paint the roof of this tank. Well, it's a pretty high roof up there. And I didn't know at that time that Roy was very willing to climb as high as he wanted to, as long as he'd keep 1 foot on the ground. And I've never been able to figure how I ever got him to go, or how he ever went up on the roof. But I remember we did it one afternoon. Went up there, and the two of us painted that roof. There's a ladder shaped device that swings around from the hub of the roof. It's a round tank, and this ladder swings around, and Roy got on that ladder, and he painted as it was the safest place on the roof. He painted the roof by just pushing the ladder around and painting, and I was just standing on the roof painting. And he said, if there's anything that you want me to do up here on this roof other than paint, you tell me about it today, because if I'm up here today, I'm going to go back down and then never come up here again.
Jeez.
And he never did.
Oh, I'm amazed you got him up there to begin with.
I'm surprised that he even considered going up, because he was death afraid of climbing, as I found out. But he went up. He's an awful good sport. Well, that was the roof.
That's wild. It seems to me, as I've talked to people and listened to folks over the years, that there was a whole lot more community interaction, volunteer effort. I remember, for instance, in the old days, the Christmas decorations were just wonderful, and it was always the day after Thanksgiving, and the men would all come down to the center of town and spend a long, cold day putting up those strings of, and as a kid,
Across the street.
it was the most wonderful thing to be taken down street after dark to see the strings of
was.
light,
It
and
was-
they had stars in the center.
Big star
Yeah,
in the center. Yeah.
It was just the most wonderful thing to see the town.
I made all of those stars out of a length. Our iron bars that we used to sell and cut up came in 20-foot lengths, and those stars were made out of 1 length of 1/4-inch round iron, and each star took 20 feet.
Wow.
They're easy to bend. Consequently, we'd have a joint where the ends
Yeah.
would come together, and Charlie Wickwire just put a spot of weld
Oh,
on
really?
there, and the stars, I don't know whatever became of them, but we had,
Well, I can tell
Okay.
you what became of them. It was kind of sad, and I was their last chapter, because they were left in my father's
barn.
And when I bought the place and I had 4 houseful loads of stuff in that barn, I eventually took them to the dump.
Did you really?
Yeah, it was
Oh,
kind of
now-
sad, but I couldn't
well,
think what I was going to do with
I often wondered
16 or 18
what had
stars
become
and all
of them.
those wires.
Uh,
Well, I'm the culprit. I got rid of them.
well, okay, I'll forgive you. I can't hate you for it.
But it does not seem to you to be true that there was more.
Oh, definitely. There's no question about it. 2 or 3 of the Connecticut Power fellows would come and connect
Yeah,
them up for us.
yeah.
Well, of course, we couldn't do it. Nowadays, you couldn't put a string of that
No.
stuff across the street. You'd
They
have
don't
to have
allow
it in. You'd have to have it insured in the
Yeah.
first place. But then, Connecticut Power was so cooperative when we'd want to do anything of that kind in town. In the early days of the fire company, and why I say early days, it went on for many years. We were never charged for power for operating the siren, for instance. Now I'm sure they get a bill for every kilowatt hour of power they consume. But then, it was so much nicer. We had a crew who would come down and do that job. There weren't a lot of men who did it. Very few of the businessmen around town.
I don't
but-
remember the businessmen, but I remember Dad, and wasn't Russ Crafts one of them? Somehow I seem to remember Russ Craft and Archie Weaver.
Archie Weaver would be one.
Uh-huh.
I don't, possibly, I shouldn't say that Russ didn't. He might have done it. But Archie Weaver is one of the power company fellas. Another one who was always there was Ed Markey.
Mm-hmm.
He was always there. There were 3 or 4 of those power company fellas who were so faithful, and they'd come and
But it's one of the things I lament now. Every time you want to do something now, you have to sit down and talk about a budget, and then we all end up either going to the merchants and saying, will you fund this, or won't you fund that? And then you go to the town to get the rest of the money, because everything's terribly expensive, and you need permits, and then you go and hire somebody to do it. You don't get a group of people to come out. I think the closest we come to a group of people dealing that way now is the beautification committee, and even that's paid.
are they?
Yeah.
There you get town money. Well, it's true that we did it. Now with those Christmas lights, it took a lot of wire. Now I've forgotten where the wire came from, but we would supply a whole lot of that stuff, sockets and the necessary hardware that went along with the coupling. For instance, we had screw eyes in the sides of the buildings
Right.
along the street, and use them year after year. And stretch those things across the street. And I don't remember where the money came from to pay for this material, but it was all we
I bet it
made.
didn't come
We
from any
made it
town
all.
government.
No, I'm sure it didn't.
Yeah.
And we made it all. It wasn't a question of hiring somebody to make it. We figured what we wanted to do and went ahead and made the stuff.
Yeah.
And I think all of that volunteer work that was done around town in those days was done the same way. I know it was in the fire company. We built a hose dryer one time many years ago, and it was fine. We worked out. Ordinarily, they dry hose by straightening the hose out 50 foot
I
lengths of
remember
hose.
that. It was on the side of the wall.
But we dried it,
Yeah.
coiled up in loose coil, roll it up and then open up the coils and put it on wire racks and slid it into this dryer, and it worked like a charm and took up, I don't know, 1/10 of the room that it would take drying the stuff all out.
How long were you in the fire company?
Oh, probably 25, 26 years, and I was secretary of it for about 23 of it, I think. I went into the company the same time Frank McCarty, same year Frank McCarty. There's Frank McCarty and Ernie Osborne and Midge Parati. There were about 6 of, as I remember, went in that one year, and that was shortly after I came to Canaan. Probably, if I came in 34, it would probably be along 36 or 37.
Because Mr. McCarthy had his 50th year anniversary several years ago now. And he
Yeah.
retired
Well,
after 50 years, which is
50 years.
amazing.
Well, if he'd gone in 37, and you put 50
that
years
would be
on it,
about
it'd been
right.
87.
That's just
You'd
about
have had
right,
50
too.
years.
Because it was several years ago. Maybe 86, maybe 86. When did my father die, 86? Something like that. Dad
You'll
died
have to
4 years
tell me.
ago, so it was 86.
86.
And I think Mr. McCarthy's anniversary was the same year.
Same year, was it?
Yeah. Because Dad was just shy
Okay,
of
then 36.
40.
Might have
yeah.
been 36.
Yeah.
That'd been 2 years after I came to Canaan.
Well, that's a long time for volunteer service.
Yeah, it is. But it was very fruitful.
Definitely. Now you're continuing your volunteer service as town historian, resident flag
Well,
raiser.
That's something else too. The flag raising business, that came about normally too, because I walked from home down to the store twice a day. I could go back home, get lunch at noon, and come back down, particularly morning and night. And one day, as I was going past, at that time, the old town hall was there on what is now the parking lot, and the flagpole stood down in front of the Doughboy. And somehow or other, Earl Smedick was standing out on the porch of or steps of the old town hall as I was going down, or at noon or sometime or other. Anyway, that's the way it happened, and just visiting, and I remarked to him that it was a shame that we had that flagpole there and there's never anything on it, because there was never anything on the flagpole. And I said if I had a flag, I could put that thing up there and take care of it in the morning and take it down at night. He said, well, if you'll do that, I'll see that you get a flag. So he did. He got the flag, and I began putting it up and been doing it ever since. They said a few years back it was 40 years, so I
Yeah.
don't know what it is now. It's 40 some. I don't know how much
That's
it is.
a lot of years.
Well, it has never been a chore. Particularly when I was in until 77, it was never any job, because it was so simple to do as I was going past. But since then, of course, I have to take it down, go down in the morning and go back down at night and take it down. And I don't mind that, except in the wintertime.
I was going to say, don't your fingers get cold in the
I
winter?
don't, no, well, it's not my fingers getting cold, and I don't mind putting it up. But leaving the house in the late afternoon in winter and going down there to do that, that's a hardship.
Yeah.
But it has to be done, because the flag has to be there, that's all. It's part of that whole thing. And to me, that whole Doughboy center that's there is one of the nicest things in town,
Yeah,
and I
it's
think it's
beautiful.
one of the things that should be taken care of.
Yeah, it's beautiful. So with this evolving role as town historian, you've been really active helping us to set up this committee, and then working on your burying ground.
The burying ground.
Sorry. It
Well-
could be a graveyard, but we won't call it a cemetery.
Any of the things that I've done since I've been historian, there's more of it now, because people ask so many more questions. I get telephone calls and letters. I had one telephone call from a doctor out in Minnesota, I don't know, maybe a month or so ago, asking if I knew anything about a certain family who might have lived here. And I've had several calls of that type. And usually I can't do very much about it. But there was one I had from a man in Virginia who was looking for a family of Tafts. And I told him that I didn't know of any Taft that had ever been here, although the Cleaton store at one time had Taft name connected with it. So I checked with our town listing, and there were no Tafts ever mentioned here in Canaan. So I went to Sheffield, because Clayton at that time was known as East Sheffield, and there were some Tafts in there. So I listed everything that there was in the town records up there, and checked with Falls Village, and they had one Taft family, one Taft man who had lived in Falls Village. So I sent that, made copies of what their records were and sent them down to him. And he didn't say that it helped him any, but I got a nice letter from him
Oh,
appreciating
that's
it.
nice.
So it's helpful. It's rewarding that way. But what I was going to say is that what I'm doing now isn't a great deal more than what I had done before as far as the history of Canaan goes. But this burying ground of Samuel Forbes, I've had on my mind for the last 3 or 4 years, and have never pushed it very much until this year. And when I went to the selectmen to find out what the situation was, well, it develops that the town is responsible for the cleaning up. I believe it specifies once a year, and for maintaining a fence around every cemetery in town.
Really?
It's mandatory that they do that. I believe it's clean it up and maintain it that way once a year, and to maintain a fence around it. So I had no trouble. I'm sure that it would have been the same whether it was mandatory or not, because I went to Doug Humes, and he was all for it, and he said, anything we can do, just let us know.
So what are you doing down there?
Well, he got his, while I was there, he called, Brad Shook, who was the foreman of the town crew, and asked him to pick me up, and we'd go down to where this burying ground is and see what needed to be done. And the following morning, Brad came. We went down, and he said he'd be very interested in getting this thing straightened around so that it was presentable. Because it was just so overgrown with weeds and bushes and vines that you could hardly see anything in it. So he took his crew down, and they've cleaned the ground off and cleaned an area off around the fence, so they can work on it, and have done a little bit of work on the fence, but they have the material so that they're going to straighten that up. And there are a few stones broken off, which I hope to have repaired. They're slabs, most of them, and they can be cemented so that they'll be standing up. And Harry Anderson and Mason Noble went in there with me one day a couple of weeks ago, and we have cataloged every
Have you?
inscription that's on any of the markers, so we know just who is in there and their death dates and so forth. And we have just about half of it done, and we'll be doing the other half soon.
I really want to see that happen down at Mountain View too, because that a lot of those stones are already illegible, and I'd like to. In fact, I wanted to do it this summer, but I never got myself down there to systematically start working across the rows and making notes.
Don't they have information? They have a map
They have a
of
map,
all
but
of those graves.
that old section is just listed as a block, and there's nothing.
Oh, that's all, nothing there. Well, it's an interesting thing to do, and if you want some help doing it, I'd be glad
Maybe
to
this
give
fall,
you a
before
hand
the
sometime
nasty
before
weather
this-
sets in, we can
before it
start
gets
in
cold.
one corner or
I'd
something.
be glad to give you a hand with it, because it is interesting to see who these people were and when they died. I'm sure those down at the Mountain View there are a lot of old ones in there. I think the oldest one that we found down here in the Forbes Cemetery was a death in something like 1792.
That's about as early as you're going to find down at the other, because the town wasn't even started until
Well-
1737, and I think the first deaths were around the 50s, weren't they?
I would think so.
Yeah.
I read an article, one of these bits of information that tells of the first death in Canaan, and I can't tell you now who it was or what, but I know where the information is.